budget presentation report because, yes, we're continuing our focus on the 23 budget proposal. Let's take a look.
9th Saturday, 2000.
At exactly 10:15 a.m., the president arrived at the floor of the House. Without waste of time, the business of the day began. The Senate President David Mark congratulated the president for the early presentation. He, however, made his feelings known.
Our stand is that Parliament is constitutionally empowered to make inputs. What the Constitution enjoins Mr. President to lay before the National Assembly are mere estimates, not immutable figures. And once the estimates are so laid, their consideration becomes subject to the constitutionally prescribed modes of exercising legislative power.
Obviously optimistic, the president walked up to the podium with a theme, Budget of Fiscal Consolidation with Inclusive Growth. The total expenditure for the 2013 fiscal year was pegged at 4.92 trillion naira, a 5% increase from 4.69 trillion naira in 2012.
Consequently, this is made up of 380.02 billion naira for statutory transfers, 591.76 billion naira for debt service, 2.41 trillion naira for recurrent non-debt expenditure, and 1.54 trillion naira for capital expenditure. Based on the above, the fiscal deficit is projected to improve to about 2.17% of GDP in the 2013 budget compared to 2.85% in 2012.
Oil production was put at 2.53 million barrels per day from 2.4 million barrels per day in 2012. An oil benchmark of $75 per barrel was proposed as against $72 in 2012 budget. The GDP growth rate target was reduced from 7% to 6.5%. Also in line with its fiscal prudence strategy, the government has mapped out plans to reduce the domestic debt profile.
A sinking fund of 100 billion naira is being established in the 2013 fiscal year to be used for repaying government's maturing debt obligations and to curb the rising domestic debt profile.
In our effort to address this concern, only yesterday, in passing the 2013-2015 medium-term expenditure framework, which is the basis for annual budget, the House resolved to raise the oil price benchmark from $75 per barrel to $80 per barrel, with the objective that the difference of $5 be channeled exclusively towards reducing the deficit in the budget and consequently reducing domestic borrowing for same purpose by 66%.
While the executive and the legislatures resolve their differences, Nigerians expect an early passage of the budget and better implementation. Chimezie Obi-Iwago for Channels Television News.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Chimezie. Well, Mr. Henry Boyo joins us now. He's an economist. Thank you for coming on this morning, sir.
It's my pleasure.
Well, looking at this budget, I mean, time and time again, we see this kind of presentations coming, expectations from Nigerians, as always. But in terms of how this intends or will address developmental challenges, particularly perhaps improving the private sector, how do you see this working out?
I agree with you totally that budget presentations have always been full of hope. But usually we find that at the end of the day, it's same of the...
sadly.
Of the same old thing. So unfortunately, a lot of Nigerians have lost confidence in expecting that the budget will transform their lives. But in terms of the private sector, which you mentioned, I don't think the budget addresses the critical issues that besetting the private sector, particularly with regards to the cost of borrowing and the high level of inflation. You might say these are monetary aspects, and the budget is basically a fiscal instrument. That may be so, but one needs to be certain that we would not have a situation where the high cost of borrowing and the high rate of inflation. As you well know, there is no country that has developed or will ever develop. I would like you to give me an example of such a country with interest rates to the real sector at over 20% and inflation in double digits. It is pure fantasy to expect that you will develop without addressing those issues. So I agree totally with you. The issue of the private sector may not have been properly taken care of or recognized in this, but I expect that they will defend it by saying that this is a fiscal instrument.
But when they talk about job creation, with all that plan to focus on women, providing a lot more jobs, empowering them economically, doesn't that in any way contribute?
The amount of jobs that the government as an organ can create is really limited. The private sector is the traditional growth driver for employment because they have the capacity, especially the small and medium-scale industries. Everywhere in the world, that is the pattern, and I don't think it would be different in the Nigerian context. So the private sector, as the driver of employment and employment opportunities, should be properly provided with an enabling environment that would make it possible for them to do so. But regrettably, in the last 30 years or so, there has been no success in that sector. It's always been, and unfortunately, a lot of people get carried away by the budget because they think, the budget will, change my life and all that. But let's face it, 1.5 something trillion for capital expenditure, that's not a lot of money. That's just about $7 billion or thereabouts. And we're told, for example, that the power sector alone, if it has to run according to, in order to be able to provide adequate power for everybody in Nigeria, as and when required, would require, depending on who you're talking to, anything from $40 billion to $100 billion. So in other words, when you're talking or celebrating $7 billion capital expenditure, I think the hope is misplaced that that will transform into any meaningful gain in terms of a real infrastructural enhancement or social welfare improvement. So to my mind, I think it's unfortunate that there's this fixation on that little capital budget. I find the fact that we are talking of a budget deficit in a year, for example, when crude oil production, I believe it's no secret that even the Minister for Petroleum Resources and other offices within the NNPC have often boasted in the last few months that production output had exceeded benchmark. Okay? At the same time, we have not really had the price of crude oil falling below benchmark either. If anything, it's been the hundreds and 110 and 115 and things like that. Okay? Added to that, you find that the Federal Inland Revenue Service has also successfully collected, I think by the end of the third quarter or something, close to 4 trillion naira, and possibly in the next 3 months or so, another 1 trillion naira. So we're talking about 5 trillion naira. The Customs Service is boasting of another, not boasting, actually, they indicated that they had collected close to 500 billion naira as at August this year. So when you look at all this, you wonder to yourself, is 10.8 billion as totally collected revenue, is that believable? Is that plausible? And my answer is definitely no. It couldn't be. We have a situation where traditionally crude oil accounts for maybe 80% of total revenue. All right? So if we have a budget of total federally collected revenue of 10.8 trillion naira, we would expect out of that, 80% of that should be crude oil receipts, right? So 20% of that should be internally generated revenue. But internally generated revenue over time, particularly this year, and there's nothing to show that the trend will change next year, account for, out of 10.84 trillion, we can expect something close to 6 trillion naira from the federal inland revenue and also the Customs Service. So you find that the combination of the Customs Service and the FRS accounting for over 60, almost 50% and above of that 10.8 it makes you wonder that is it now that do we now have a situation where we now have 50% contribution from internally generated revenue and another 50%? But that can be so, because we know that crude oil prices and output have consistently exceeded budget benchmark.